This screencast is to help students studying the edXL certificate IGCSE when faced by issues regarding Anthology B, that is to say the short story section of the anthology, for paper 2 of the English language paper of that exam. Now, paper 2, 2 questions, but we're going to look today at question 1 only. And question 1 will ask you to analyse either one of the short stories from Anthology B or one of the poems from Anthology B. It seems slightly strange that this is a short story or a poem, and many students seem to be put off by the fact that they find the short stories rather more difficult in their minds than the poetry, possibly because the short, of course, are longer. The exam, it's worth just looking quickly at the features of the syllabus. You're asked to show that you have understanding of the text, the ideas and perspectives of the writer, and of course the usual language structure and form that is required. And I think in the poetry this is possibly slightly easier to come to terms with than 2 or 3 pages of relatively dense prose. Overall, there are 24 marks to be had for this question, which is half the marks available for the paper, and, because of the weighting of the examinations, 10% of the overall marking. Again, for assessment, you're being marked for AO2 reading at this point. You need to be able to show that you can read and understand texts with insight and engagement, really beginning to show that you can analyse and comment on why ideas are being used, why certain effects are created in certain ways. Develop and sustain ideas and perspectives. A consistent essay which develops ideas but also sustains a response to the question. This is very important. And finally, what they're calling some evaluation of writers using linguist and structural devices to achieve their effects. This structural devices, again, is something that in the prose often seems slightly harder to achieve than in a poem where, if you like, the structure is very often so obvious at first glance. What I would say, though, is that I don't really see that one is easier than the other. Every question will come with bullet points, so use them, and use those to guide you in the approach to the essay. The key features of any form of writing tend to be the same. The key features will tend to be the way the sentences are put together, long sentences, short sentences, use of dialogue, in terms of this, direct speech, something of that nature. The type of writing, is it heavily figurative, full of metaphors and similes? Is it heavily descriptive, in terms of strong descriptive language, or whatever it will be? But I think ultimately it's very important that you do add some form of clear structure to what you are writing. And in that case, slime or SCASI would seem to me to be the ways forward. If you are sensible, and I'm sure you are, this will help you to organise your thoughts in such a way that the writing about the passage becomes a good deal easier. Now, before we start to look at one passage in some detail, I've just started a process here using language actually from the edXL Teacher's Guide, so it gives you an idea of what perhaps they are looking for. Trying to just work out for each of the stories a distinctive style, and this is something that I think you should complete if you are revising. Just simple paragraphs that give you an idea, before you even start, about the question, about the passage that you're going to comment upon. So, for example, if we take the hero, simply because it's the story we'll use later, we're told that it's economically and dynamically told. Humour is central to the impact. We have to have that idea in terms of that. We notice the dialogue being referred to, the structure of the story. Many examples of stylistic features. There's a less important for students to show knowledge of technical terms, to show how these work for the writer's purposes. Again, focus on what the writer is trying to achieve. A good understanding of the central characters is essential, and the themes, which include family relationships, growing up, and different concepts of courage. Now, All these ideas will become relevant as we move into a discussion of that text in a moment. But I really do suggest now that you spend some time thinking about the three stories I haven't written anything for here, to decide what the basic features, structures are in those stories, to give yourselves a starting point should you come across these in the exam. So, having done that, I hope, coming back to this screencast, let's have a look at a typical examination question here. It's on the screen in front of you while I talk. And this would seem to me to be pretty typical. It again comes from the edXL material that they give us to make suggestions of how exam papers will look. And you can see straight away a clear question and a selection of bullet points. The first thing we might need to do is make sure that we actually get the question clearly. What are the keys we're going to have to look at here? We need to see the tensions in the relationship between father and Swami, and to what extent these have been resolved by the end of the story. In other words, you've got a question about father and Swami and their relationship. You're being told that the relationship is one full of tension before you even start, but to some degree these tensions may well have been resolved by the end of the story. There you go. That is what you have to address. What is the relationship at the start? What is the relationship at the end? And how is this come? So, let's have a look. We're going to, I think, apply slime to this, and we'll do that in a moment to the question. We look at the bullet points. We know that they have disagreements, for example, about the views on the newspaper article we're being asked to consider, their disagreement about the sleeping quarters of Swami, Granny herself, and then commenting on the change on the relationship, the impact of the incident with the burglar. Now, if you do all this well, then the last bullet point, the writer's use of language, will have been dealt with within the others, and you will not have a need to come back to it. What you have to remember at all times, though, is that the focus is always on the question, this idea of tension and resolution. So we might start our introductory paragraph, possibly structure setting sort of paragraph, considering the very opening of the story. Why not work through in this way? The story opens in a type of writing that we call in medias res. You don't need to remember that phrase necessarily, although it's quite a nice one. In other words, it starts right in the middle of the action. There's no introduction, there's no attempt to put us in a place, a setting. We know we're in India, it's a Narayan short story. But this simple opening sentence, for Swami, events took an unexpected turn. Short sentence sets up immediately questions for us, and also a sense of excitement, this unexpected turn. Straight away, we're in the middle of an energetic story. In that opening section, the father is characterised quickly at this stage by language associated with him. He stares fixedly, he sneered, as the pair disagree about a story in the newspaper concerning bravery. Father sees this story as the absolute epitome of childish bravery. Swami, on the other hand, simply doesn't believe the story. He just says, well, a boy can't have been a boy. We see the difference in attitude between them. Father, looking at his son, wanting to see his son begin to grow up, and as we will see, prove his bravery. Swami, still a child, simplistic, doesn't believe it, and actually ends up trying to take the conversation somewhere else in a discussion about cricket. What we also see in this opening section, though, in terms of the way the story is structured, is the beginning of a story which has a great amount of direct speech, which carries a narrative. For the whole story, apart from one section, which is the section that deals with the descriptive writing of the actual event that is the ghost story. And it's this, then, that is going to be a difference for us later, although we have to remember that a simple description of the ghost story is not going to be the focus of this question. Looking at language, perhaps becoming therefore after an introductory paragraph in which we've established some character, as well as talked a bit about the newspaper and so on, we move into the next bullet point, and that is the bullet point dealing with where Swami should sleep. We make the point that he's currently next to his granny, and Dad wants to make him an adult by making him sleep alone. For father, and again the characterisation is developed in this way, this is a way to prove courage. It's a way to make sure that the courage is a proven idea rather than a suggested idea. So it's a way of showing that he must prove this. The father is forceful, brief. He uses the verb must when discussing the proposition, and it therefore becomes a necessity. And Swami, as we try and establish the difference between them, sees this as a frightful proposition, and the idea is, of course, that he is simply terrified of it. This idea of being terrified will come back later in the story. Granny is introduced because the mother declines to have any part in this argument, and the granny, sitting up in her bed, obviously has a power over the father. The father doesn't argue with his mother. He gloomily reads his newspaper. He seems somewhat wary of confrontation with her. And at this point, then, we've got all sorts of contrasts being established. The contrast between Swami and his father, the contrast between the father's treatment of Swami and his response to the granny, the contrast between the mother and her perspective of where she is in the family, and the grandmother in terms of the effect on the father. However, father is victorious, and Swami's reaction is again shown in terms of this issue of where to sleep by the language. Verbs like slunk, his head is bowed, he's pained and angry. We do, however, see one of the few hints that there are that father is not a vicious, unpleasant, unkind man purely for the sake of it. He addresses Swami here as little fellow. He does, from time to time, show hints that he is sympathetic and trying to encourage his son rather than just bullying him. And we have to wonder whether underlying this relationship is a sense that it is not as cruel and harsh as it first appears, and that might become useful as the essay develops. In the imagery section, I want to move to the third bullet, the effect of the incident of the relationship. Now, what we have to remember is, if we're going to talk about the effect of something on the relationship, then we have to know what the state of the relationship before the events of the evening are. So we've got anger, dissent, and a total lack of understanding between the pair of them. We need to work out how that changes by the end. That's central to the question. And we will realise, of course, that by the end, Swami has proved himself in his father's eyes, and is eventually allowed to sleep by Granny, even slightly grudgingly, which we'll come to in a moment. So in order for this to happen, we need to move the dialogue, and Narayan does this by moving away from the dialogue-driven narrative that we've seen thus far, and to a narrative which is much more redolent of maybe a ghost story, something of that nature. Everything about it heightened. And I've chosen one paragraph here to try and show this. Now, ideally you would pick from the 2 or 3 paragraphs of this section, but purely for convenience, let's just go with one. Having set up the relationship, we now move into a section of the story that is almost purely atmospheric. It is designed to show us Swami's terrors building up with the tension towards the denouement and the biting of the ankle. There's a number of devices here. We have relatively short sentences, with a few others thrown in for good measure that are very short. We notice sentences starting with "and," each one acting to pile ideas onto the one before, and the very short sentences, such as "he was faint with fear," which we see to absolutely clearly state a sense of tension within the narrative. The pace has increased. Events are building on top of each other. There's a ray of light which is personified and enters the room. A ray of light from the street lamp strayed in and cast shadows on the wall. Now, this is slightly foreshadowing what will happen with the burglar, but again is building up a sense of threat. It strays in, and the shadows will again serve to frighten the young boy. The language is full of sensory imagery to develop the sense here that within the stillness of this room, the small things reach his ears, the ticking of the clock reminding him of time passing so slowly, the rustle of trees, snoring sounds, and some vague night insects humming. Again, a short sentence follows. He covered himself so completely that he could hardly breathe. Again, a sense of a child terrified. Every moment he expected the devils to come up and carry him away. And he carries on remembering these instances from his childish life where apparently people have been carried off into the distance by ghosts. Childish terrors, running high, in a way that is ultimately designed to build tension in the manner of a ghost story. Much attention paid to creating an atmosphere of tension, an atmosphere of fear, so that the event, when it happens, of course, can increase the sense of Swami's heroism after the event. And in fact, it's worth noticing how, in terms of structure, the story moves very, very quickly after the event to its eventual ending. It's a swift conclusion, and held as a hero. So as we come to the final chunks of our essay, the meaning effect areas, we now need very clearly to answer the question. And we need to do this while showing an awareness of whatever else is in the story. There is humour here, there's no two ways about it. Swami is not a hero, but he's treated as one. We have to remember that the most notorious housebreaker has been bitten on the ankle and caught as a result of panic induced by fear of a devil or monster. The reality is something much, much more mundane. So for father, who wanted to see proof of bravery, this is what he was looking for. Absolute proof that his son is brave. Swami, in his eyes, once he returns home, even though he's now sleeping with his granny again, and being protected by the women of the house, is seen as a clever boy. No longer the sneering, no longer the musts and the attacking of the earlier sections. The relationship is on a complete change. And the change has been brought about, in essence, by a level of respect for the son by the father, which has been brought about or engendered by a series of completely unintentional events. Swami has not been reinvented in reality. We notice that when he's questioned by the head teacher, he says he actually thinks rather that he wants to be an engine driver, not a policeman. But his father has now new admiration for him as a result of the events of the night, and the relationship has moved on. Now that would answer your question quite effectively. You would certainly have been relating to the text, you'd certainly have been talking about how language is used, you'd be showing a knowledge and understanding of the text and the subtext. You would be able to establish that you understood how the relationship has moved from where it was at the beginning to where it was at the end, all within a structure that would have enabled you to write probably a 5-paragraph essay, one for each of the SLIME mnemonic, in a manner that should have attained good marks. Remember that in this question, if you get one of the short stories, the focus may well be on characterisation. And I think that it would be a good exercise, I know we've done this in class in my school, to look at each of the stories and chart the progress of the characters. Ideas, therefore, might be the way that sympathy is generated for the boys in Charlotte Gray. Maybe things to do with, writing to do with the contrast between the boys, maybe attitudes towards or attitudes of the boys, and the older prisoners, or even the people who are not prisoners but are adults outside their world. In The Necklace, we might want to discuss whether or not Madame Loisel is a sympathetic character. We also might want to discuss their marital relationship and how this is changed, if you like, by the story. Don't ignore Monsieur Loisel in this story. In the King Shahryar story, I think the real focus here, presumably, is on the bravery and determination of Scheherazade and how she shows this bravery and determination, the selflessness that she does show because she wants to protect women rather than because she is out for anything of her own. The contrasts between characters and the fate of characters in Veronica are very, very strong. This might be more generalised into an essay, I suppose, about attitudes to women in the countryside and in the city. Remember in this story that there is a definite sense that the narrator has a change of heart, in a sense. He despises women in the city because he sees them as money-grabbing, grasping, flirtatious, flighty things. Unlike Veronica, who of course is being treated appallingly back in the village of her birth. Remember, whatever you are asked to do, try and apply a structure, and remember to try and engage with the text throughout. That way, you should find yourself climbing up the mark scheme sufficiently to get yourself into a band that will reward you. Remember, this paper is only worth 20% of the IGCSE. It's not a paper even if you were to get 100% in it, which is going to save your bacon if paper 1 has been a disaster. That said, the more marks you get in this paper, obviously, the more chance you have of a high level of success. I hope this has been useful. Thank you for listening, and cheerio.